The scent of industrial-grade lemon polish and the faint, metallic tang of old money clung to the air in the penthouse suite. Amara pushed the service cart, its wheels a soft complaint against the thick pile of the cream-colored rug. This was her rhythm, the predictable geometry of her new life. Fold the corner of the toilet paper into a perfect triangle. Smooth the duvet until not a single crease marred its surface. Erase any trace that a human being had ever slept, or dreamt, or lived in this space. She was a ghost, and she was good at it. For a year, this was how she had survived. In anonymity. In the quiet, demanding work of making things pristine for people whose lives were anything but. The Midnight Seoul Hotel was a fortress of glass and steel piercing the sky, and she was just one of 100 maids in an identical gray uniform, her name a simple Amara on a plastic tag, her past a locked room she never visited. Her hair was braided close to her scalp, tucked neatly beneath a service cap. Her body, full and strong, moved with an efficiency born of necessity. She had learned the geography of every floor, the hum of the service elevators, the precise moment to knock, and the exact tone to use when saying housekeeping. She had built a wall around herself with these routines, brick by painstaking brick. Today, she was training a new hire, a quiet woman named Jisoo, on the Grand Royal Penthouse, the most expensive room in the hotel, usually reserved for visiting royalty or tech billionaires. Today, it was occupied by a man whose name on the ledger was simply Mr. Kwon. Always start with the bathrooms, Amara instructed, her voice low and even. Strip the towels, then spray the surfaces. Let the cleaner sit while you do the bedrooms. It's about efficiency. Jisoo nodded, her eyes wide with the sheer opulence of the suite. The bathroom was larger than Amara's entire apartment, a cavern of Italian marble and gold-plated fixtures. Amara ignored it. She had learned to see luxury as just another surface to be cleaned. She was demonstrating how to polish the chrome faucets without leaving streaks when the door to the suite clicked open. Her body went rigid. This was a breach of protocol. Guests were supposed to be out during service, or at the very least, they were announced by the front desk. She straightened up slowly, turning, her professional and slightly apologetic smile already forming on her lips. "Sir, I do apologize. We weren't expecting." The words died in her throat. He stood in the entryway, framed by the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the sprawling city of Seoul. He wasn't just a guest. He was a monument carved from shadows and bespoke tailoring. The suit was a deep charcoal, a Tom Ford by the cut of it, fitting his broad shoulders in a way that spoke less of fashion and more of armor. His black hair was styled perfectly, not a strand out of place. But it wasn't the suit or the hair that made the air in the room crystallize into something sharp and cold. It was his stillness, a predator's stillness. And his eyes. They were dark, so dark they seemed to absorb the light in the room, and they were fixed on her. Not on the uniform, not on the name tag. On her. A year of carefully constructed peace crumbled to dust. Jisoo bowed her head low, murmuring a respectful greeting, but Amara couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The lemon polish scent was suddenly suffocating. Her heart, a long dormant thing, began a frantic, panicked beat against her ribs. He took one step into the room, and then another. His shoes were handmade leather, polished to a mirror shine, and they made no sound on the thick carpet. He moved like the world rearranged itself to get out of his way. His gaze swept over her, a physical touch that felt like being branded. It took in the plain gray uniform, the sensible shoes, the tired lines around her eyes she saw in the mirror every morning. A flicker of something, disbelief, pain, a fury so deep it was silent, crossed his features before being locked down behind a mask of cold control. "Leave us," he said. The command was not loud, but it had the weight of absolute authority. It was not directed at her. Jisoo, sensing the tectonic shift in the room's atmosphere, scurried out without a backward glance, the service cart rattling behind her. The door clicked shut, leaving Amara alone with the ghost she had run an entire continent to escape. Kwon Ji-han, her husband, the most dangerous man in Seoul. He said her name, and the sound of it in his voice was a key turning in a lock she thought she had thrown away. Amara. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. A claim. She had rehearsed this moment in 1,000 nightmares. In every version, she screamed or she ran or she fought. But standing here, with the scent of his cologne, sandalwood and something cold, like winter smoke, filling her senses, all she could do was cling to the only identity she had left. She dipped her head in a shallow, respectful bow, the way she would for any guest. Her voice, when it came out, was a stranger's. Flat. Deferential. Empty. "You have me mistaken for someone else, sir," she said, her eyes fixed on a point on the marble floor. "My name is on my tag. Is there anything else I can get for you?" The silence that followed was a living thing. It stretched and pulsed with a terrible energy. She could feel his gaze on the top of her head, feel him dissecting her lie, her pathetic defense. She willed him to believe it, to see the maid, the uniform, the stranger, and to walk away. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, as if it had been dragged over broken glass. "Look at me." She didn't. She couldn't. If she looked at him, the lie would fall apart. The maid would vanish, and the woman who had shared his bed, who had seen the blood on his hands, who had fled his gilded cage, would be standing in her place. "I said," he repeated, and this time the cold fury was unmistakable, a razor's edge in the quiet room. "Look at me." Slowly, as if pulling her head up against a physical weight, she lifted her gaze. And it broke him. It was not the defiance he expected. It was not the fear he could have understood. It was the vast, terrifying emptiness in her eyes. The carefully practiced blankness of a service worker who has been trained to be invisible. She was looking right through him, her expression a perfect mask of polite, impersonal inquiry. For one shattering second, the formidable Kwon Ji-han, the man who commanded a criminal empire with a single word, looked utterly lost. The pain in his eyes was so stark, so raw. It was a physical wound. He saw his wife, the woman he had torn the city apart to find for a year, the woman he believed had been stolen from him, and she was looking at him as if he were just another piece of furniture to be polished. "Stop it," he whispered. The sound was ragged. "Whatever this is, stop it now." Amara's training, her survival instinct, screamed at her to hold the line. She gave a small, confused shake of her head. "Sir, I think there has been a misunderstanding. I'm just here to clean your room." That was the moment everything changed. The flicker of pain in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by something far more dangerous. A cold, hard certainty. He closed the distance between them in 2 silent strides. He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. His proximity was a cage in itself. "You will come with me," he said. It wasn't a request. "I can't," she said, her voice finally trembling, the first crack in her facade. "I have to finish my shift." A humorless, cruel smile touched his lips. "I own this hotel, Amara. Your shift is over." He turned and walked to the door, pulling out his phone. He spoke in rapid, low Korean, his voice clipped and precise. Orders. She didn't need to understand the words to know their meaning. Locks were being changed. Records were being erased. A ghost was being captured. He ended the call and looked back at her. The mask was firmly in place now. He was no longer the broken man. He was the boss. The king. "My men are on their way up," he said. "They will escort you to the car. You will not make a scene. You will not speak to anyone. You understand?" She stared at him, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. She had been found. The life she had built in a year of silence had shattered in a single, spoken word, her name. And now, she was being dragged back into the one place she had almost died to escape. The elevator ride down from the penthouse was a descent into a past she'd tried to bury. Jihan stood beside her, not touching, but his presence filled the small space, sucking all the air out. 2 of his men, dressed in suits as sharp and dark as his own, stood with their backs to the door, their posture radiating a quiet lethality. They hadn't looked at her once. To them, she was not a person. She was cargo, a recovered asset. Amara kept her eyes fixed on the illuminated numbers as they counted down the floors.
60.
59. Each number was a step back in time, undoing the piece she had so painstakingly assembled. She could feel Jihan's gaze on her, but she refused to meet it. Her blankness, her denial, was the only weapon she had left. They bypassed the grand lobby, exiting through a private service elevator that led to a subterranean parking garage. The air was cool and smelled of concrete and exhaust. A black sedan, so polished it looked like a pool of liquid shadow, waited with its rear door open. One of the men gestured for her to get in. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, a wild instinct screaming at her to run.
But where?
The garage was a concrete tomb, and these men moved with a predator's economy. There was no escape. She slid onto the cold leather seat. Jihan followed, settling beside her, and the door closed with a solid, final thud. The world outside disappeared. The car moved silently through the city, a ghost in the river of Seoul's traffic. Amara watched the familiar streets blur past the tinted windows, landmarks of a life that was no longer hers. The small noodle shop where she ate on her day off. The corner where she bought flowers for her tiny apartment. All of it belonged to a stranger now. They arrived at a residential tower in Gangnam that made the hotel look modest. The car descended into another private garage, stopping before a private elevator. This one opened directly into his penthouse. The door slid open, and Amara's breath caught.
It was exactly as she remembered.
A vast, open space of glass, steel, and cold white marble. Minimalist furniture was arranged with surgical precision. It was less a home and more a museum exhibit on wealth and power. And it was just as empty of warmth as she remembered. Jihan walked past her, shrugging out of his suit jacket and tossing it onto a sterile-looking white leather sofa. He loosened his tie, his movements fluid and controlled. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a heavy crystal glass, the ice clinking with a sound like breaking bones. He finally turned to her, leaning back against the bar. The silence stretched, thick with a year of unspoken words. "I thought you were dead," he said, his voice low and raw. The control was starting to fray again now that they were alone. "For a year, Amara. I tore this city apart. I tore our rivals apart. I searched every morgue, every hospital. I had men on 3 continents. And you were 5 miles away cleaning toilets." The bitterness in his last words was a corrosive acid. He took a swallow of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving her face. "Why?" he asked. The question was a single, wounded syllable. "Who took you? Who did this to you? Give me a name."
She saw it then.
The narrative he had built in her absence. She had been taken. A victim. A pawn in a war with a rival clan. He had built a story where he was the avenger, the one who would burn the world down to get her back. The truth, that she had run from him, was a possibility his pride, his entire worldview, could not entertain. She could give him a name. She could lie. She could invent a kidnapper, point him like a weapon at one of his enemies, and maybe, just maybe, find a way to disappear again in the ensuing chaos.
It would be the smart play.
The survivalist play. But she was so tired of running. So tired of lying. She simply shook her head, her gaze dropping to the polished floor. "No one took me, Jihan." He slammed the glass down on the marble countertop. The sound cracked through the quiet room like a gunshot. "Do not lie to me."
Not now.
I saw the reports. The apartment was torn apart. There was a struggle. There was a struggle because I was in a hurry, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I packed what I could, and I left. He stared at her, his mind visibly refusing to process her words. He walked toward her, stopping just a foot away. She could feel the heat coming off him, the tightly coiled violence he held in check. "You left me," he whispered, the disbelief stark in his voice. "You walked away." "I ran," she corrected him softly. That was the moment his wound was truly revealed. It wasn't just the loss of her. It was the betrayal. The idea that she had chosen anonymity and poverty over him and his empire was an insult he couldn't comprehend. The story he had told himself, of her as a stolen prize to be reclaimed, was his shield. And she had just ripped it away. "Everything I did," he said, his voice dangerously low, "I did for you. The power, the wealth, it was to keep you safe. To give you everything." "I was never safe," she replied, finally meeting his eyes. The emptiness was gone, replaced by a deep, weary sorrow. "I was a beautiful bird in a beautiful cage, Jihan. And the bars were closing in every day." He flinched as if she had struck him. He had no response. The tactical mind that could orchestrate a war was useless against this simple, devastating truth. He turned away from her, running a hand through his perfect hair, messing it up for the first time. He paced the length of the room, a caged tiger in his own territory. Amara stood her ground, her legs feeling weak. She could have run. In that moment of his stunned silence, she could have bolted for the elevator. But she knew it was pointless. And some small, exhausted part of her knew the running had to stop here. She had made a choice by telling him the truth. A choice to stay and face the fallout, whatever it may be. He stopped pacing and looked at her, his expression unreadable. He gestured to a dining table that could seat 20. "You're thin," he stated. It wasn't a compliment. It was an accusation. He picked up an internal phone and spoke a few words in Korean. Minutes later, a side door opened and a woman in a crisp uniform entered, pushing a cart laden with covered dishes. The aroma of rich beef stew and freshly baked bread filled the air. The woman set the table for one, never once looking at Amara, and then disappeared as silently as she had come. Jihan gestured to the chair.
"Eat."
It was an order, but underneath it, she heard something else. A flicker of the man she had once known, the one who would notice if she'd missed a meal. It was a small, almost deniable tenderness, a gesture of care wrapped in the language of command. She didn't move. He let out a long, frustrated breath.
"Amara."
"Please." The please hung in the air between them, a foreign and fragile thing. She walked to the table and sat down. She looked at the lavish meal set before her, a meal that cost more than she made in a week. Then she looked at him, standing across the vast, silent room, watching her. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with the ghosts of what they had been, and the terrifying uncertainty of what they were now. She picked up her fork. It was a surrender and a truce.
"For now."
The truce lasted less than 24 hours. Amara awoke in a guest room that was as luxurious and impersonal as the rest of the penthouse. Silk sheets, a closet filled with clothes in her size she would never wear, and a window that looked out on a city that felt 1,000,000 miles away. There was a guard stationed outside her door. She was a guest and a prisoner. She spent the day in a state of suspended animation, wandering the cold, silent apartment while Jihan was gone. She refused to turn on the television or touch the books on the shelves. To engage with this world was to accept it, and she wasn't ready. She was a ghost in this house, too, but this time it wasn't a choice. He returned as the sun was setting, casting long, dramatic shadows across the marble floor. He looked tired, the lines of his face drawn tighter than the day before. He didn't speak to her, just nodded curtly as he passed her on his way to his office. Amara was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights begin to glitter like a fallen constellation when the world exploded. It started with a sound from outside, a high-pitched whine, followed by the percussive thump of something heavy hitting the building. Then the window beside her shattered inward, a spiderweb of cracks erupting into a cascade of glass. Instinct, honed by a year of living with him, took over. Amara dropped to the floor, crawling behind the solid marble base of a ridiculously expensive sculpture. Jihan burst from his office, a gun already in his hand. He moved with a lethal grace that was terrifyingly familiar. His eyes scanned the room, instantly finding her. "Stay down," he roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. More sounds followed, the distinctive crack of rifle fire from a nearby building, the splintering of wood as bullets tore through the expensive furniture. This was a professional hit. Coordinated. An assassination attempt. This was the world she had run from. The constant, simmering threat of violence that could erupt at any moment, shattering glass and lives with equal disregard. Jihan's men, materializing from unseen rooms, returned fire, their movements a synchronized dance of death. The penthouse became a war zone. The air grew thick with the smell of cordite and dust. Amara pressed herself against the cold marble, making herself as small as possible. A bullet ricocheted off the sculpture above her head, showering her with stone dust. She squeezed her eyes shut, her heart hammering against her ribs.
Then a new sound.
The crunch of boots on broken glass from the balcony. They were inside. One of Jihan's men went down with a choked cry. Amara risked a glance. An attacker, dressed in black tactical gear, was advancing into the room. He raised his rifle, aiming not at Jihan, but directly at her. Time slowed down. She saw the muzzle flash. She saw Jihan's face twist in a mask of fury. He moved faster than she thought possible, crossing the room and throwing his body in front of hers. He grunted as a bullet slammed into the body armor beneath his shirt. The impact threw him back against her, his weight a solid, warm shield. His breath was hot against her ear as he shoved her further behind the sculpture. "Don't move," he breathed, the words a harsh command. The firefight was brutal and short. Jihan and his remaining men were ruthlessly efficient. When silence finally fell, broken only by the distant wail of sirens, the pristine penthouse was a ruin. 3 bodies in black tactical gear lay on the floor. One of Jihan's men was wounded, another was dead. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving Amara trembling, her limbs feeling like water. Jihan was crouched over the body of one of the attackers, his face a grim mask. He checked the man's pulse, then swore under his breath. 2 dead, 1 is still breathing, one of his men reported. The wounded man was groaning, clutching a bloody leg. Jihan's man drew his weapon, preparing to deliver the final, silencing shot. Interrogation was one thing, but a live enemy was a liability. "Wait," Amara said. Her voice was thin, but it cut through the tension. Both Jihan and his man turned to look at her. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaking. She walked over to the wounded attacker, her eyes assessing the injury with a strange, detached calm. The bullet had gone through his thigh, and he was bleeding heavily. An arterial bleed. "He'll be dead in 5 minutes if you don't stop that," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. She looked at Jihan. "He's no good to you dead." Jihan stared at her, a flicker of surprise in his dark eyes. She had crossed a line. The old Amara, the one who ran, would have been hiding, crying. This Amara, the one forged in a year of lonely survival, was thinking. She was analyzing. She was seeing the world through his lens, not as a matter of right and wrong, but of assets and liabilities. It was a morally gray act, preserving the life of a man who had just tried to kill her, not out of mercy, but for tactical advantage. Jihan gave a sharp nod to his man, who holstered his weapon. He then looked at Amara, truly looked at her, and saw not the maid, not the victim, but a survivor. A queen who had temporarily forgotten her own strength. Later, after the bodies had been removed and a cleanup crew was silently erasing the evidence of the battle, they were alone again. The broken window was boarded up, a temporary scar on the face of perfection. The air still tasted of smoke. Jihan poured them both a whiskey. He handed her a glass. Their fingers brushed, a spark of heat in the cold room. "I didn't know you had that in you," he said, his voice quiet. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of discovery. Amara took a sip of the whiskey. It burned a welcome trail down her throat. "You learn to be practical when you're on your own." He stood beside her, looking out at the boarded window. "Why did you run, Amara?" "The truth." The adrenaline of the attack had stripped away her defenses. The lies and evasions felt pointless now. The danger was not a memory. It was here in this room. "I overheard you on the phone," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "About a month before I left. You were talking to your uncle. He was questioning your decisions."
"He mentioned me."
He called me your foreign distraction, your weakness. She saw his jaw tighten, a muscle jumping in his cheek. You told him, she continued, her voice gaining strength, that a weakness can be a weapon, if used correctly. You said, let them think she is my heart. The heart is the easiest target to bait a trap. You were talking about me. You were planning to use me as bait. He was silent for a long time. The city hummed below them. It was a lie, he finally said, his voice rough. To deceive my uncle. I knew he was the traitor. I was feeding him misinformation. It doesn't matter if it was a lie, Jihan, she said, turning to face him, her eyes blazing with a year of repressed pain and fear. It was the truth of my life. I was a target, a liability, a thing to be used or protected or hidden away. I wasn't a wife. I was a possession, a beautiful, fragile piece of your empire. The truth of it hit him, visible in the sudden tension in his shoulders. So I ran, she said, her voice breaking on the last word. I didn't get taken. I wasn't stolen. I left. I ran from you, from this life, from being a target painted on your back. This was the confession, not of love, but of its opposite, of the fear that had poisoned everything. It was more honest, more dangerous, than any declaration of affection could ever be. He had believed her a victim of his enemies, but the truth was so much worse. She was a refugee from his love. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his face went pale beneath his tan. A new kind of dread, cold and sharp, entered his eyes. What is it? She asked. He looked at her, and in that moment, she saw genuine fear on his face for the first time. That was from the interrogation, he said, his voice flat and devoid of life. The Choi clan. The ones who attacked. They weren't trying to kill me. They were trying to get to you. The blood drained from her face. They didn't know where you were for the past year, he continued, the words coming out as if they physically pained him. They just found out you were back. The attack wasn't an assassination attempt on me. It was a kidnapping attempt on you. They want the bait for their trap. The enemy hadn't just escalated. They had made it personal. They were no longer targeting the king. They were targeting his queen. And, this time, she couldn't run. The plan was simple, and that's what made it so terrifying. The Choi clan, led by a ruthless man named Choi Miho, wanted to force a territory war. They knew Jihan would not negotiate if they held Amara. They believed she was his only vulnerability, and they intended to carve it out of him. The interrogation had revealed their next move. They were going to create a public distraction, something that would pull Jihan and the bulk of his security away from the penthouse, leaving a small window for a second, more surgical team to extract her. I will not leave you, Jihan stated, his voice a low growl. He was pacing his office, a map of the city displayed on a massive screen. You have to, Amara countered, her voice surprisingly steady. She was no longer the frightened maid. The attack had reawakened a part of her she thought was long dead. If you don't show up to the meeting they're forcing, they'll see it as a sign of weakness. They'll escalate. It'll be all-out war in the streets, and more people will get hurt. I do not care who gets hurt, as long as it is not you, he bit out, his control snapping. I do, she said softly, and the words stopped him cold. He looked at her, and for the first time, he seemed to see the chasm between their worlds. He dealt in acceptable losses. She still believed every life had value. What do you propose? He asked, his voice tight with grudging respect. That I leave you here with a handful of guards while the city's most vicious animals come for you. No, she said, a spark of an idea forming. You leave me here with a handful of guards and you make them think it's working. She looked around the ruined living room, at the boarded-up window. They think this place is a fortress. But I know its weaknesses. For a year, she had studied buildings, not as an architect but as a cleaner. She knew about service corridors, ventilation shafts, forgotten dumbwaiters. She knew how a structure breathed. She had learned the secrets of the Signal Hotel, and she was willing to bet this building had similar veins running through its walls. The climax was not a pitched battle, but a deadly game of chess. Jihan, against his every instinct, followed her plan. He left for the forced meeting across town, taking a visible motorcade of his best men. He left a skeleton crew at the penthouse, just as the Choi clan would expect. Amara was the queen on the board, seemingly left undefended. The moment Jihan's motorcade was confirmed to be miles away, the attack came.
It was silent this time. No explosions.
Just a team of ghosts rappelling down from the roof, cutting through the glass of a bedroom window. But Amara wasn't in the bedroom. She wasn't cowering in a panic room. She was in the main service conduit, a cramped, dusty space behind the kitchen wall she'd discovered earlier. With her was Jihan's most trusted lieutenant, Park, and two other men. She had instructed them to abandon the penthouse's main floor, to make it look like they'd been overwhelmed or had fled. She watched on a small tablet, patched into the penthouse's hidden security feeds. She saw the Choi clan's men sweep through the empty rooms, their frustration mounting. "They're heading for the master bedroom," Park whispered, his gun held at the ready. "Let them," Amara whispered back. "The real trap isn't here." Her decisive action was not one of violence, but of intellect. She had told Jihan the attackers would be arrogant. They would believe they had outsmarted him, and their arrogance would be their undoing. Using a burner phone, she sent a single text message. 2 floors below, a small, precisely placed charge, planted by Jihan's men hours earlier, detonated, disabling the private elevator. At the same moment, the emergency stairwells were sealed by electromagnetic locks Jihan's tech team had installed. The penthouse, once Amara's prison, had now become a trap for her hunters. They were caught. Jihan's voice came through Park's earpiece, crisp and cold. "They're sealed in. I'm 5 minutes out." He had never gone to the meeting. His motorcade was a decoy. He had been circling, waiting for her signal. The Choi clan's men realized what had happened. Panic replaced their professional calm. They were rats in a steel trap, and the exterminator was coming home. The final confrontation was swift and brutal. Jihan and his returning force swept the penthouse, eliminating the trapped soldiers with surgical precision. Amara heard the muffled sounds of the fight from her hiding place, her hand gripping Park's arm. When it was over, Jihan's voice came over the comms, stripped of everything but raw urgency.
"Amara.
Report. We're safe," she said into Park's radio, her own voice shaking slightly. The door to the service conduit was wrenched open. Jihan stood there, his face streaked with grime, his suit torn at the shoulder. He looked past his men, his eyes finding hers in the dim light. He didn't say a word. He just held out his hand. She took it. His grip was firm, grounding. He pulled her out of the darkness and into the ruined, blood-spattered light of his world. After the last body had been taken away, after the last of his men had left them, they stood on the balcony, the cool night air balm on their frayed nerves. The city glittered below, oblivious. A cost had been paid. Jihan had lost men, and to end the threat of the Choi clan for good, he had been forced to make a deal with a rival Yakuza clan, ceding his shipping routes through Busan. A piece of his empire, sacrificed for her. Nothing in this world was free. He turned to her, his face illuminated by the city glow. The cold mask of the boss was gone. In its place was a man looking at a woman he had almost lost twice, once to her own fear, and once to his enemies. "I was wrong," he said, the admission costing him more than any territory. "To ever think of you as a weakness. You were never my weakness, Amara. You were the only part of this life that was ever real." It was his acknowledgement of what she was to him. Not a possession, not a liability. His anchor, his truth. She looked at his hand, noticing a deep gash across his knuckles, blood still welling from the cut. She stepped forward, taking his hand gently in hers. She reached into the pocket of her borrowed silk robe and pulled out a small, antiseptic wipe from a first aid kit she'd found. As she carefully cleaned the wound, he watched her, his dark eyes tracing her features as if memorizing them. "I will burn it all down," he said, his voice a low, fierce promise. "I will walk away from all of this, if it means you will stay." She paused, looking up at him. She saw the empire laid out before them, a kingdom of light and shadow. And she saw the man who ruled it, offering to abdicate his throne for her. A year ago, she would have accepted in a heartbeat. She would have taken his hand and run. But she wasn't that woman anymore. She had faced his world, and had not just survived, but conquered. Running was an escape. Staying was a choice. She finished cleaning his hand and wrapped it carefully with a strip of cloth torn from the hem of her robe. She did not answer his offer with words. Instead, she looked from the sprawling city back to his face, and for the first time in over a year, she leaned in and pressed her lips to his. It was not a kiss of passion, but of promise. A claiming. A decision made not in fear, but in strength. She was not leaving. She was staying, not as his weakness, but as the queen to his king, ready to rule the darkness by his side.